But good evening and welcome to tonight's program, where we'll be discussing Susan Blumberg-Kason's book, Bernardine's Shanghai Salon, The Story of the Doyenne of Old China. We're going to have first a quick few words from our hosts. I'm Gee Salisbury, Board President of the Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club, also known as SAPAAC. We were established in 1989 and have historically been one of Stanford University's largest ethnic affinity groups and one of the largest alumni organizations with nearly 3,000 members. We are dedicated to connecting Asian American and Pacific Islander API alumni to the university and to each other. Membership empowers you to attend numerous events in your region, engage with a thriving alumni community, and receive the latest communications about our alma mater from an AAPI perspective. So if you're a Stanford alumni who's tuning in and you're not already a SAPAAC member, we highly encourage you to join the club, which is free, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. So to learn more about that, you can visit SAPAAC's website, which is just sapaac.org, and I'll drop a link in the chat later on. And now I will turn things over briefly to Teddy Kidder at the Stanford Jewish Alumni Network.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. Thank you for being here. I'm Vice President of Programming and Events for the Stanford Jewish Alumni Network. We've only been around for a few years. We are exactly what we sound like, the Stanford Jewish Alumni Network. So, if you have friends, family, others that are interested in joining, please email us, s-jan@alumni.stanford.edu. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Susan for being here and doing this. And thank you so much to Katie for coordinating this. And we're so grateful for the partnership with SAPAAC. This is the second event we've done together this year, one in person, and now this one. And it's really wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Teddy. So for tonight's program, we will feature a short presentation by author Susan Blumberg-Kason, followed by moderated conversation, and then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes of questions from the audience. And since we started late, we're going to go over a little bit later, but the event is being recorded, so if you miss some of it, we will post it later to our YouTube channel. For the questions from the audience portion, feel free to start putting your questions in the chat, or you can also use the Ask a Question feature in Zoom. I also want to remind you, it's a great time to pick up a copy of Susan's book if you haven't already, because March is Women's History Month, and we'll also put a link to buy it in the chat. So tonight, our featured guest and speaker is Susan Blumberg-Kason, who is the author of Bernardine's Shanghai Salon, The Story of the Doyenne of Old China, a 2023 Zibby Awards finalist. She is also the author of Good Chinese Wife, A Love Affair with China Gone Wrong, and the 2024 Zibby Awards winner, When Friends Come From Afar, the remarkable story of Bernie Wong and Chicago's Chinese American Service League. She is also the co-editor of Hong Kong Noir and a regular contributor to the Asian Review of Books, Cha and Asian Literary Review, and World Literature Today. Her work has also appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books and Pop Matters. So with that, let's welcome Susan.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. I'm so honored to be here. And if you're just joining in, this will be, like Katie said, this will be recorded. So I'm going to just share some slides to bring you back to 1930 Shanghai, and then we can go from there. So this is so you see, this is Bernardine. You can see that. So Bernardine was born in Peoria, Illinois, and I'm in outside Chicago. So she grew up was born not so far from where I am. And she married and divorced 3 times by the time she was 29. And back in the early 1910s, it wasn't common for women to date and then marry. You kind of dated to marry. And so she was traditional and she wanted to be a wife and be a mom, but she got into these marriages and they weren't great for her. So she, by the age of 29, was in Paris and had taken a trip halfway around the world and got to Shanghai in late 1928 and met a silver broker from North Dakota who had been in China for about 10 years. And he lured her back. Well, she came back to Paris, but he lured her back to marry him. And she was 33 at that time. So this is the Shanghai that she moved to. And if you've been to Shanghai, a lot of this will look familiar because not much of it has changed. Apart from the piers are not there anymore. And there's this beautiful, the Bund is the waterfront promenade. And there's this beautiful riverfront walk and people take wedding photos there. The Peace Hotel is very prominent. This pyramid roof is an emerald green at night. And that was built and run by a Baghdadi Jewish man named Victor Sassoon, who was a friend of Bernardine, and Bernardine's husband had offices in this building. And then these are other buildings here are banks, and they're still being run as hotels and banks now. And the beautiful thing about Shanghai is that this part has been pretty much preserved as it was in the late 20s and early 30s. And then across the river is the new space-aged Pudong, which is all the new contemporary parts. So when Bernardine got to Shanghai, of course, her husband wasn't the person he advertised himself to be, just like the other husbands. And she had two choices. She could either stay or she could go back, but go back to where? She didn't know where home was. She hadn't lived in the US for a while. Her friends in Paris weren't going to stay there. Some were going back to New York. Some were going to the south of France. And she decided just to do what she could and stay in Shanghai. And she started meeting Chinese educators and writers, and they invited her to their home. So she reciprocated and opened her home as a salon. So thus the title, Bernardine Shanghai Salon. And this is just, these are just two pictures of her home. And these are where people congregated, and sometimes she'd have up to 150 people a night, both foreign and Chinese. And so I saw the home in 2019 when I was last in Shanghai, and it was an apartment unit, and I think, and it's also corroborated by some Shanghai historians, we think her unit was right here on the front. And it was a huge unit. The building was open that day, and so I walked into it, and it was being restored, so everything was empty. But I got lost in one of the units I walked into. It was so big. So after 150 people started going to her salon, it got to be too big, because in a salon you want to talk to people, and it's not like a cocktail party where there's small conversations, but it's like one theme, like a musician or a poet would read or perform, and then people would talk about it. So to allow more people to enjoy the arts in this way, she started a theater company called the International Arts Theater, so the IAT. And it wasn't just a theater. They had lectures, they had classes about set design and stage makeup. And so the tie-in with Katie's book is that Bernardine was a friend of Anna May Wong. So Bernardine is here, the second from their right, and then Anna May is in the middle, and Bernardine's fourth husband is Chester Fritz here. And it may be hard to see, but Chester does not smile. He doesn't have a sense of humor, and he liked having the attention of all these glitterati, but he was not a good husband. And Bernardine and Anna May started writing to each other when Anna May was in Shanghai in 1936. So I just want to show a couple of letters. The first one, this is from Anna May to Bernardine, and you'll notice it says, "Dear Mrs. Fritz." That's a very formal way of addressing somebody. And this is February of 1936. And by June of 1936, they're very close friends at this point, and she calls her Bernardine. She never calls her Mrs. Fritz after that. And at the bottom, it just, Anna May wants to know if Bernardine would come to Tianjin, which is near Beijing, where Anna May was staying at the time. And she wanted her to send her a telegram to the Citibank in Peiping, which is Beijing. So they had this great friendship. Anna May went back to the US at the end of that year, and Bernardine left at the end of 1937, which was the following year. But while Anna May was in the North, Bernardine went to go visit her, and this is one of the photos of Anna May just in the countryside, meeting with people there. And Bernardine took this photo, and we have a good story about how Katie got this photo. Like, she got the original one. So it was, there were these, and the photos are really small, so they've been preserved all this time. So when Bernardine left in 1937, her daughter from her first marriage was sick, and she went to go tend to her in New York. They took a train across the country and settled in LA. And so this is these are just a couple of photos from LA. And Bernardine and Anna May, and then the man in the middle is Lin Yutang, who was one of the most famous writers at the time, and he made the New York Times bestseller list in 1936, and he wrote in English, and his wife was also a big cookbook writer in English. And this is the same dinner, but it just shows that this friendship continued, and Bernardine and Anna May continued writing for a long time. Anna May died before Bernardine did, and Lin Yutang, his wife, and Bernardine wrote to each other through the early 1970s. And Bernardine, this is her in LA. She kind of recreated her Shanghai living room, and she has this satin dress that was made in China, and it has embroidery. And she ended up divorcing her fourth husband, never married again. And she moved from house to house in LA because her alimony wasn't very much. And every time she sold a house, she made a little bit more money and lived off of that, and sold off most of her Chinese artifacts, which is really sad. And she passed away from complications of emphysema or COPD in 1982. So that is the brief slideshow.
Thank you for that overview. You showed it to me before, but I always loved seeing that photograph of Bernardine's where she lived in Shanghai. Because, when I see it, I spent 2 summers of my Stanford college experience in Shanghai, and I feel like I must have definitely walked past that building. I don't know, it looks so familiar. So it's really fun to see it.
Yeah, it's in the former French concession, which, that's very popular, especially with tourists. And it's so beautiful. They have these London plane trees that just kind of form a canopy over the streets. And her street, it's Fuxing Xi now. That is the front entrance, and it has those canopy. Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's a really beautiful part of Shanghai. So just going back to your why you ended up writing this book, how did you first learn about Bernardine, and what made you want to write about her?
So it goes back to Shanghai in 1995. I was married for the first time to a man from Hubei province, which is Wuhan is the big city in Hubei. But he was from 2 hours outside there. So we were in Shanghai for most of the summer of 1995. And that Peace Hotel that I showed in the beginning with a pyramid roof, my parents came for my wedding banquet, and we met in Shanghai. And my mom wanted to stay at that hotel because it was so famous. And it wasn't, it's beautiful now. The Fairmont took over and just management of it, and they remodeled it back to like the 1929 original Art Deco interior. But when I stayed in 1995, a lot of it had been plastered over, and it was nice, but it wasn't like, super luxurious. But in that hotel, they had a little gift store, and there was a book called Shanghai in 1937 by a woman named Vicky Baum. And she was an Austrian Jewish writer who wrote a book called Grand Hotel, and it was optioned to Hollywood. And she moved to Hollywood before the 1930s, or maybe early 1930s. And she had traveled through Shanghai, and she wrote this fascinating novel about all these different people that stayed at the Cathay Hotel, which was the Peace Hotel back then. There were Russians and Germans and British and French and Chinese and Japanese, and just everyone that interacted in that hotel. And then it was bombed in 1937 when World War II basically started there. So I got interested in like that type of like cosmopolitan time in Shanghai. I didn't know anything about that. And then I picked up a book by Emily Han, who wrote about Shanghai at that time and Hong Kong, and it came out in 1944. And on page 5, Bernardine appears. And she is written about as if like we should all know who she was. It was like Emily had left Shanghai and gone to Hong Kong, and she said she really wished Hong Kong had a salon like Bernardine's. And, you know, it was kind of like a backwater place at the time. And so after that, so that was like the mid 90s, I kept, you know, coming across Bernardine's name, mostly in books about Emily Han. So there was a biography of Emily Han that came out in the late 90s. So Bernardine showed up there. There was a book called Shanghai Grand that came out in 2016 by Taras Gresko about that hotel and Victor Sassoon and Emily Han. And so Bernardine showed up there, but not in a good way. She was portrayed as a busybody and a gossip, and it wasn't the way that Emily had portrayed her. And I started to become more curious. And when I found out that she was from Peoria, I thought I need to know more about her.
I love that story because it's just by chance that you kind of ran into her while reading someone else's book. I mean, so one of the things that Bernardine is a fascinating person. She always seems to like have found her way into the upper echelons of like the intellectual and artistic elite, no matter where she was. Like she brushed shoulders with Hemingway in Paris, was seen at Hollywood parties when she returned to the US. And then, of course, she made an indelible mark on Shanghai's, you know, elite Chinese and expat community. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was about her that made her like such a powerful social connector, like a force to be reckoned with.
Well, I think she was really curious. That was the one thing that that drew her to Shanghai and to Paris before that. And she wasn't educated beyond high school. And a lot of her friends, even the women friends, had gone to university. So Emily Han was an engineering student at the University of Wisconsin. And I think she was a little bit insecure about that. And so it caused her to read a lot and to become very invested in the arts. And she never could finish anything. So that's why we don't know her for any writings, although she left behind tons and tons of vignettes that she had basically like written a book. But in these, literally, there was a chapter about Lin Yutang and about travels to Suzhou in China and Hangzhou. And she never could finish any publication. So she didn't write books. Her theater was like her passion. She never wrote a play, but she was, you know, in the short term, she could have a salon, you know, twice a week and invite people. And it became word of mouth after that. And a true salon is really like, there's no invitations, just like word of mouth and people show up. And she would invite like a Chinese poet who would recite something and then people would discuss it. So it was kind of this like kind of organic meeting. And she was just a great connector and had a very vibrant personality. But I think if she had been more focused, she probably would have become a writer, I would think. She was a very beautiful writer, and her descriptions are just things I couldn't have done, you know.
Yeah, no,
I quote from her, so you know.
No, I absolutely agree because you were kind enough to share the passages she had written about meeting Anna May Wong, and I ended up using a few lines of what she wrote as one of the epigraphs to my book because it was such a powerful image, and to me it felt so astute the way that she kind of sized her up. So she was a really wonderful writer, and it's too bad that she wasn't able to, in her lifetime, kind of commit to that project. But maybe, it's great that you kind of were able to connect with her family and get access to those papers that I'm sure no one else has seen, right?
Right, because I found she has a granddaughter, so her marriage, the first marriage, she had a daughter, and that daughter had a daughter, and the granddaughter is still alive, and she lives in Washington State. So I happened to find mention of her online. She had written about Bernardine in a Buddhist newsletter, and so I emailed the editor of this newsletter in late 2018 and asked, I said I'm writing a book, but I didn't know if I was going to have enough material at that point. But I wanted to. And so I asked if she had, her name was Feather. So I asked if she had Feather's email address or contact information. And within an hour, I was in touch with Feather. And so she put me in touch with two relatives, one in Berkeley and one in LA. And they both had, just in their homes, hundreds of Bernardine's writings and photos. And I made day trips there in 2019 when I was in Phoenix for spring break and got to take photos of all those. And I couldn't have done the book without that. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's like hitting the jackpot as a researcher. So speaking of your own experiences in Asia, because you've spent you've lived there and traveled through other parts of China, I'm curious about how your own experiences in Asia may have influenced or informed the way you wrote about Bernardine in Shanghai.
Sure. So her life in Shanghai was not easy, mainly because her fourth marriage was not functional. And her husband, Chester, would give her the silent treatment, and he would criticize her for, her clothes or whatever. She was really concerned about her appearance. But when she had her salon, it gave him face, it made him feel more important. And he had a lot of Chinese friends in the business community, which was unusual for expats at the time. But there were a lot of really difficult parts of her life, when she was in Shanghai. And so I could relate to that because when I was married the first time to my first husband from China, we had this really horrible scene in Shanghai. I had run out of things to read for the summer and it was only June. And he told me that there was this foreign language bookstore near the Shanghai train station. And we were going to take the train from Shanghai to Suzhou, where he was doing his PhD dissertation fieldwork. And we were both grad students in Hong Kong, and we were going to meet his professor from Hong Kong in Suzhou. And he said, we'll go to this foreign language bookstore. I can get some books in English, and then we can carry on. So we get to the train station, and he says, okay, we're going to board the train. And I said, well, what about the bookstore? And I just said it like that. And he accused me of being a spoiled brat. And he said, there's no time, and we have to rush to the train, and his professor's waiting for him. And I was really confused. And I must have had this look of disappointment on my face. And he got really upset and gave me the silent treatment, didn't talk to me at all on this 2.5-hour train ride to Suzhou, which now is 45 minutes on the bullet train. But it was horrible. And I just felt like I could understand what it was. I could put myself back in that 1995, Shanghai train station scene and understand what Bernardine felt like, but she was living there as her husband was treating her badly, and how she made a good life out of a bad situation, which I really didn't do. So
But you wrote this book.
I did, yeah, and I wrote a memoir about that marriage, and so that
right.
scene is in my book.
So you made lemonade out of lemons. Well, going back to Bernardine's Salon, for those who haven't read your book yet, I wonder if you could talk about some of the different kind of personalities and maybe names of people might be familiar with.
So there was a Chinese poet named Sinmei Zhao, or his Chinese name is Xiao Shunmei. That's in Mandarin, but the Shanghai dialect was Zhao Sinmei. And he had been in France and I think England. And at that time, the educated Chinese in Shanghai were quadrilingual. They knew English fluently, a lot knew French fluently, Shanghai Hua and Mandarin, and there was German. I mean, it was just so multilingual. And Sinmei was, he wrote in English, and he became very close to Bernardine. And people always thought that there was like something between them, but there wasn't. I mean, he and Emily Hahn had she became his common law wife, even though he had a wife and a bunch of kids already. But Sinmei was an early attendee of her salon, and he would bring, he brought Butterfly Wu, who was a silent movie star. She was like same as like Charlie Chaplin, but in Shanghai, and also fluent in English. But of course, if you're like a silent movie star, you don't have to speak, But and Anna May was a silent movie star too. That's how she started, because everyone was, it was all silent movies then. So Sinmei was a big part of her salon. And then when Emily Hahn came to China for 6 weeks, supposedly, she went to Bernardine's salon and then ended up staying in China and Hong Kong a total of 10 years because of the people she met at her salon. Victor Sassoon, as I mentioned before, who was the hotelier, he was a part of it too. And she had Sun Yat-sen's son, Sun Fo. He was a part of the salon. She had people who were on opposing political sides. So there was like the Soviet foreign minister's wife became part of the International Arts Theater as an organizer. And then she had the head of Jardine, which was it's a Hong Kong conglomerate now. So they had come from England or Scotland and then came out to Asia during the Opium Wars or before that. And that's kind of how it all started. But so they were like, uber capitalist and in the same room with like the Soviet foreign minister's wife. And they're all doing things together around the arts. There were university presidents in Shanghai and fashion designers. I mean, it was just, she had like people from all walks of life. So it was really special.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what a treat it would be to actually get to attend one of her salons, right? To be in a room with all of those people. Sounds truly fascinating. So let's see, I'm looking at my other questions for you. Well, I guess we could talk a little bit about, I mean, I think people have probably already guessed, but the reason that you and I first connected was because you were writing about Bernardine and I was writing about Anna May Wong, and I saw this article that you had written about their friendship, and it just made sense that when, you're two biographers writing about two subjects who were friends in their time, it made sense for us to be friends. And it was fun getting to kind of share resources and different things that we knew about each other's subjects. So with all of that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you learned about Bernardine and Anna May Wong's friendship. I mean, which is also itself has its own story because they meet first in London and then again in Shanghai, and then later they're both in Los Angeles. So it's kind of fun to see how their relationship develops across different places.
Yes, and the meeting was not very positive at first, the way Bernardine writes about it. She was invited to a lunch from Madame Wellington Koo, and Madame Koo was, Wellington Koo was an elder statesman of China and was in London. And Madame Koo was the one who supposedly had the cheongsam or the qipao like more form fitted. It was more just
right.
like a shift. I mean, it wasn't like form fitted, but then she did it that way. She was very stylish. And so there was this reception or lunch, and Bernardine saw Anna May at first, and had a not great description. And there were, I think, she wrote about it twice. And, what I found that your biographer, like the subject of your biography is not always a reliable subject. So sometimes Bernardine will have like two versions of the same story. So it wasn't great. It was like 1934. Bernardine had a breast cancer scare, and Chester was being like even worse than normal. So she goes back to Shanghai and Anna May comes in 1936, and then they meet and they become really close friends then. And I could see in the letters, there were about 7 letters that I found from Anna May to Bernardine. And so I could see how that friendship developed from the Dear Mrs. Fritz to Dear Bernardine. And then Anna May goes up to Beijing, what's Beijing now, and rents a house in a traditional Chinese home there and asks Bernardine to come visit her. And Bernardine goes. And she, the Chester part is like not working out. And Anna May was always single and or unmarried. She wasn't always single, but she was never married. And I think they connected because they both had kind of like a loneliness sometimes, and they understood each other. And so when Anna May goes back to the US, Bernardine's daughter now is grown and is in New York and has a lot of health problems. And so Bernardine has this tendency to push off her mothering duties onto her close friends. And she did this a lot with a friend in Paris who was an American there. And then when Anna May is in the US after she knows Bernardine, Bernardine will push the mothering duties onto Anna May, and she does it. I mean, she checks in on Rosemary, and so they stay connected that way. Any documents of Bernardine and Anna May is about 1939 or 1941, but because you had letters that go way beyond that, I learned from you that I just thought they had not stayed in touch, but I learned that they actually had. And Bernardine had seen Anna May almost, at the end of Anna May's life. And so, or towards it. And so, so I learned from you that this friendship actually was decades long. It wasn't just a decade long. So.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it really went until Anna May Wong passed in 1961. And, because I hadn't, after meeting you, then I understood Bernardine's place in Anna May Wong's life. But before that, I, didn't really know much about her. And so that kind of opened up things. And I went back to the Yale Beneke archives, which I know we've both seen because that's where Bernardine's correspondence is and where Anna May Wong's is. And it finally occurred to me that Bernardine was also friends with, the Van Vechtens and Fania, and that there would be correspondence between them as well, which ended up being an interesting source of information where Fania and Bernardine would kind of keep up on like, oh, what's Anna May Wong doing? So they were there until she passed. And I think one of the letters, a later letter from Bernardine to Fania, talks about Anna May Wong passing, if I'm remembering that correctly. But yeah, I mean, it was, and it's interesting to think about how their first meeting was not a good meeting, and then later it developed into this really close relationship.
Yeah. Because if you just saw the first meeting, it's just easy to say like, okay, Bernardine was not a nice person, and she was very opinionated, and she like described people. She had met Mussolini's daughter soon after she moved to Shanghai, because Mussolini's son-in-law was the the deputy consul general in Shanghai. I mean, he was stationed there. And Bernardine described Edda Mussolini as having like a disease that eats you from the inside out. It was very like graphic, and it was not like, that wasn't nice.
But that's sometimes what makes you a good writer. Right.
But, she was like very, she described people as, in these interesting ways. And the same with Anna May, but then later, they were such, I really love, that was like the nicest surprise, I think, in my research, just finding that friendship. And I have a whole chapter about it. So, yeah.
So your book provides kind of this inside look at the elite circles running in Shanghai in the 1930s, which I think for many of us, especially if you've visited Shanghai, because the architecture is still so, Art Deco reminiscent of that era, it seems like this magical period in at least in Shanghai's history, especially knowing what happened afterwards, right, with World War II. So I'm wondering if you could speak about what made that period so dynamic and such an exciting time to be in Shanghai.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were like other cities that were kind of like that, like Cairo in the 20s and Berlin in the 20s and Paris. And there are these places that just attracted people in the arts. And all these big writers would go through Shanghai. Like Noel Coward wrote a play there. George Bernard Shaw went there when Bernardine was there. Martha Gellhorn was there when she was a reporter. And it just, I don't know, it was an open port, so it was easy. But the thing is, like, there was no jumbo jets, there were no jets, and people didn't fly really, much at all. And if they did, it was short distances. So everyone was going by boat, and it took a long time, but they made the time for that. And it just was, there was like international commerce there. All these big American companies had offices there, architecture firms, law firms. The US had a court there because of it was cut up into the French concession was run by France. And then there was this international settlement, that's a map of old Shanghai behind me. And so I think the pink part is the international settlement but I have to turn around to look. And then so the international settlement was first started by the US and the UK. And we don't really learn about this in US, history classes, but it was like a small colony. And so it was US courts, US law, with Britain. And so that was kind of hard because it was like these two countries, and they developed this municipal council that when Bernardine got to Shanghai in 1929, 14 countries had representatives, and this international settlement, Shanghai Municipal Council. So it was all these different countries, and it was all for business reasons. And so because all these, countries are kind of running the show, the laws applied to them in the settlement. It wasn't, if they had committed a crime and ran to China, they couldn't be tried in China, but vice versa. People committed a crime in the Chinese part of Shanghai and went into the French concession or the international settlement. They had immunity there because it wasn't the same jurisdiction. So I don't know, it just, because of that, like, colonial system, and then it was a very vibrant, you could do anything there. There was gambling, there was 2-horse race courses. I mean, that was like from the British. They had dog racing. They had like circuses. I mean, it was just like a lot of jazz. A lot of American jazz musicians went there. It just was a place where people could reinvent themselves. There were a ton of refugees from China, from all over. China had been in like a civil war, and people came down to Shanghai. And refugees from Russia. So during the Bolshevik Revolution, the White Russians, who were not the Red Russians, came down to Shanghai. So there were a lot of, and then there were the Russian Jews, who were different, because there were like 10,000 Russian Jews, and there were a big White Russian community. There were Germans, there were Japanese. So it just, it was very open. And I think it was very forgiving, but also very poor. So like the disparity between wealthy and poor was huge. And that was also a problem too. So it wasn't all, it wasn't all great, as no place ever is, but,
Right.
but she understood that. And she even made a comment that she could understand why the communists won, because it was so, it was like either you were really rich or you were living in the sewers, and it was really hard. So, but that was like that comment was in the early 50s, I think. So early. But,
reading about that period in Shanghai and having, researched more about like the 1920s in the US and in Europe, it almost seems like the Jazz Age the Roaring Twenties ended when the stock market crashed, at least for the Western world, but it feels like it continued over to Shanghai in a way, and like that's where the party was. Of course, until war shows up, and as you say, like there's always cracks, in the seams, and not everyone is at the top of society and doing well, which
Yeah.
makes sense with regime change and the political dynamics there.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just, you said like when the stock market crashed and that was kind of the end of the jazz age. One of the things that I learned researching the book was that I had, studied Chinese history a lot, but I didn't really understand that World War II actually started in Shanghai in 1937. So we think of it in Europe in the 1939. For us, it was 1941. But Japan was trying to take more territory in China. And so they bombed Shanghai in 1937, and China fought back and had a lot of help from the US. And China was the US's biggest ally, I mean, population wise. And so the war started there, and that 1937 bombing in Shanghai put an end to all of that era of Shanghai. So it was similar. And once World War II ended, the Civil War started again. So really it was like 1937 was kind of like the 1929 in the US.
Right. And that's also why I love when you show the photo of Bernardine, Lin Yutang, and Anna May Wong, and there's that other photo of the rest of the dinner party. But it kind of shows you how a lot of people had to flee China when war broke out, and they ended up, finding themselves in the U.S., not realizing that they might never go back. Because I think Lin Yutang spent a lot of the rest. I mean, I don't know if he went to Taiwan
and Hong Kong and Taiwan, because he had daughters in both. So, and the U.S., he was in New York for a bit too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting how that scene was completely broken up, and some people survived it and some people didn't. So I have one last question before we get to audience questions. So for those in the audience, if you do have questions, feel free to start dropping them in the chat if you like. My last question was just about, you showed that one photo of Bernardine later in life with her, I think a silk Chinese skirt. And I mean, every photograph of her, she's really just so fabulous looking. She has a great sense of style. I always love that. I don't know if you showed it tonight, but or actually maybe at the dinner, she's wearing a turban and she always looks so great in them. So I wonder if you could speak a bit about how she cultivated her fashion sense, and was that just something that goes hand in hand when you're a salon hostess? You have to be fashionable.
Yeah, I mean, she was eccentric. So I've done other longer presentations, and when she gets married, she has her collar goes up to here and her hem goes down to the ground, and then it progressively, when she marries Chester, she has no sleeves. She's a sleeveless sundress that goes just below her knees. So she lived through this huge change in fashion. And in China, she just loved, like Anna May did, the tailors there. I mean, Shanghai has some of the world's best tailors, especially at that time. And so she had, everything was tailor-made, and she loved fashion. She started wearing a turban, definitely in Paris, but maybe before that when she was in New York. And the Met, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, has these purses that there's clutches that she had made in Shanghai with
oh wow,
with scales of some type of reptile, and then there's these really different things from animals. I mean, it was there's scales and there's bones, some type of bone, but it's stitch. I mean,
gosh.
Yeah. And her cousin Nancy in LA told me that these purses are in the Met, and
wow.
they're in storage, but she sent me photos of those purses that she had done in Shanghai. And so, anything could be done there. So it was But it was
Well,
like a very high fashion, and so it was like
yeah.
she loved that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think that those purses are in the Met because Anna May Wong has a few items there too. Her famous dragon dress from Limehouse Blues, and then I think a few other personal items that she owns. So they're both enshrined there in the Met.
That's so great. I mean, there should be like an exhibit someday of like,
Yeah, that would be fun. Um, all right, so I'm going to open it up to some of the audience questions. We have a question from Bruce. He asks, could you elaborate on Bernardine's Jewish background and practice? And I'm guessing that Charles Fritz was not Jewish.
Right. So of the four husbands, her third was Jewish. His name was Otto Liveright, and his brother Horace Liveright was a publisher, and Liveright is still a press. And so Bernardine came from a Hungarian Jewish family. The parents had immigrated around 1890 from Hungary, and they went to Peoria because they had relatives there. And if anyone is at all familiar with Peoria, which I'm not counting on it, but there was a department store there called Zold's, SCOLD''S, and that was her cousin, or uncle. So that was her maiden name was Zold. And when she married the first time, her husband wasn't Jewish, and she eloped with him because her dad was so upset that she was dating a guy that wasn't Jewish. And so she was going to show her dad, and she was like 17 or 18. So they eloped that night. And that didn't really work out, but they did have a daughter. So they were what we'd call secular, probably. I mean, the parents moved from Peoria to Gary, Indiana when Bernardine was 12, and they belonged to a temple there, a synagogue there, but Bernardine never was religious. And during World War II, she became more involved in Jewish causes in LA. But the interesting thing is, although she wasn't observant, the people that she flocked to in Shanghai were Jewish, like Emily Hahn, Victor Sassoon. There was a Russian musician named Aronov Shamalov, and he wrote Chinese ballets. He composed these ballets based on Chinese folk tales, and Bernardine produced those in Shanghai. He was Russian Jewish, and she was friends with a doctor from Germany who was Jewish, and he was one of the first refugees that went to Shanghai in 1933. And she had him talk at the International Arts Theater because he was friends with D.H. Lawrence and had a copy of the banned book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And so he talked about that in 1933. So yeah, I would say she was secular, but had a very strong, cultural identity.
We have another question from Ahmed, who asks, how did Bernardine engage with Asians and Asian Americans when she came back to the US? And they say, sorry, I haven't read the book yet, but plan to.
Oh, thank you. So when I was writing the book, I felt like I was the right one to write it because I'm Jewish, I'm from Illinois, Bernardine was too, and I had spent time in Shanghai, and I wasn't trying to impose anything. And I don't think like Bernardine did that either. And I think she was very, like I said, very curious, and she wanted to like learn other cultures. And in her writings, she writes like some Shanghai Hua, which is like the Shanghai dialect. She writes like some little phrases in her like dialogues that she writes. So I felt like she was very respectful, and she had a lot of, especially female friends in Shanghai who are Chinese, and was very close with them. And then Lin Yutang was a male friend, and she writes so much about him. I mean, I think like if there was any crush, it would be him. But she went on vacation with his family, his wife and his 3 daughters. So she continued those friendships in America with Lin Yutang, and there was a pilot Oh gosh, it's all in my head. But there was
I know who you're talking about.
She was a female pilot.
Something like something
Oh yeah, Ya Ching.
Yaching, yeah.
Yeah. So she was
Aviatrix.
Yeah, she was an aviator. Yes, and so she had a lot of female friends who were Chinese, and Shanghai was the peak of her life, and so she always talked about it. She decorated her home in all those artifacts, and yeah, so I think it was always a big part of her life, even when she wasn't there. And if it was her choice, she wouldn't have left, but she did, and then the war broke out, and so
yeah, it was the thing that nobody had planned for, right? That happened.
Yeah.
Well, we have time for a few more questions if anyone else would like to ask something of Susan. And in the meantime, I was going to ask you, aside from Bernardine, is there anyone who attended, if you had a chance to meet someone who attended her salon, who would it be?
Oh gosh. There was a friend called Ching Yi who was she and a woman named Daisy Kwok started a dress shop in the Park Hotel where Anna May stayed on her 1936. Right. And so Ching Yi was one of Bernardine's good friends, and her dad was big in the government before it had gone Republican. So when it was still like the end of the Qing dynasty, her dad was in the government, and then Ching Yi spent a lot of time in New York and France, and she was very cosmopolitan, but she would have these like black and green, like she'd paint her nails like black and green, and she would have these dresses where the back would go all the way down. I mean, she was very, modern.
Yeah.
And she just seemed like Bernardine just like really loved her and talked about her a lot. And I would just love to like go to that dress shop. And it was called Ching Yi, but the Wei Giles was like TSINGYI or YIN. Maybe it was Ching Ying, but she was called Ching Yi. But then the dress shop was like TSINGI. So it was like a variation of her name, and it had this like the font was very 1930s and not Art Deco, but just I don't even like Cubist. I don't know. It was just like it was. I don't know. I'd want to go to that dress shop, and I'd want to have tea with Ching Yi, I think.
That sounds so fun. I think that, I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but I think that Anna May Wong might have even done a fashion spread wearing some of her creations that were like sketched and then put in the newspaper, something like that.
I remember some sketches. Yeah.
So it seems like, it does seem like that was like the hot dress shop, clothing shop to like go check out if you were a woman about town.
It was East and West. So they did like some like were Chinese design, some were Western, and some were like, mixed. And it just seemed, and these are like, society ladies that did this, but it was just
right.
Yeah. And Daisy Kwok was another character that I liked. So I like them all.
Well,
yeah.
Well, when people read your book, they'll get a taste of all of them.
Yes.
And so I think that we don't have any other questions. So I just want to thank you so much, Susan, for making time to talk to us tonight about your book. And thank you to everyone again for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. But this was such a lovely conversation.
It was so much fun, and thank you so much for inviting me tonight. It's such an honor.
Yeah, and well, I guess it's the end of Chinese New Year, but it's still the beginning of the Year of the Horse. So happy Lunar New Year and happy Year of the Horse to everyone.
Yes, yes. It's a fire horse, which is a special
Yes,
horse. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.